Good afternoon, everyone. Today we would like to draw your attention to an issue that you may not be aware of, land right for indigenous people. Well, none of us are indigenous people, but why do we want to stand up here to voice for them? Because indigenous people are part of us. Everyone should have the same fair treatment and have the same rights. So, indigenous people should not be left behind. Look at this picture. Indigenous people have a lot of problems that need to be dealt with. But do you see those big land walls? Land rights, land rights, land rights. Land rights is the most serious problem they have been facing. Do you hear their voice? Land right, they want land rights. Okay, so let's look at how serious this problem is. 400 years ago, our Taiwan indigenous people had all the lands. Gradually, they lost more and more of their lands. Now, they only have very few lands. But why? Because their lands have been stolen by the government. The stolen lands? Yes, because some of their lands were invaded by foreign colonies. Some were taken by the government, and some were transferred to those who were wealthy. Therefore, the SDG goals they want to advocate here are number 10, 16, and 17. We hope we can reduce inequality, establish justice, and strong institutions for protecting our indigenous people's rights. And further, we need to work together with other countries to help them. Next, we would like to present you two cases of indigenous people's land rights. Case of Australia and case of Canada. First case.
I'm going to present the case of Australia. What do we see in these pictures? They want land. Do you know why they want land? Let me explain it by some maps. Before 1788, all the lands in Australia belonged to indigenous people. After this year, all the land were taken by the British and the Australian government. In 1976, 50% of land in Northern Territory were returned to indigenous people. From 1993 to 2013, indigenous people had taken back 20.5% of land. How did indigenous people get their land back? Let's look at this map. The blue part means indigenous people had the right to own or occupy the lands. But the government would, but it doesn't mean the government will definitely return the lands to them. For example, they requested the Michelle Ellis rivers to be given back, but the government decided to develop this land into national park. Yet, the government allows indigenous people to co-manage the park. And the yellow part means indigenous people don't have the land's ownership, but they can legally use the land. What has the Australian government done for their indigenous people? They return the parts of land to indigenous people and also allow them to co-manage the national park, and also they allow them to use the lands of no return for cultural activities. Next, let's hear the case of Canada.
What did you see in this picture? Indigenous people are showing two big banners which says they want their homes on their own land. Why? Because around 500 years ago, the only people lived in Canada were indigenous people. However, because of colonizing, their lands became less and less, and they need to voice for their land rights. In 1655, New France colonized several parts of Canadian lands. In 1763, New France ceded its colony to British. In 1871, the government signed treaties with the indigenous people. They took some of their lands and promised them to give money to them in exchange. However, some of the indigenous people never got the money. Therefore, in 1990, the indigenous lands only left down to 0.2%. So, what did the government do? In 1982, the government gave the money to indigenous people for not being able to return the lands back to them as compensation. Between 1992 to 2016, the government gave the lands back to the indigenous people. In this map, you can see all the sections were the returned lands, which cover 40% of Canadian lands in total. Therefore, the two most important things that the Canadian government has done for their indigenous people were giving money compensation and return their lands back to them. Now, I believe you understand more about the problems that the indigenous people will encounter and how Canada and Australia dealt with those problems. Now, it's time for us to look at how those problems were dealt with in Taiwan and what can we, young people, do for our indigenous people.
So, what did the Taiwanese government did for our indigenous people? In 2016, President Tsai decided to deal with the problems of indigenous people, and the good news was 13% of indigenous lands were returned to them in 2017. However, the rest of the lands were not returned to them because most of the lands were privately owned now. So, the government cannot return the rest of the land. Perhaps our government should learn something from Australia and Canada. For Australia governments, they set a national parks to let their people to live there and manage the parks. And the Canadian government gave the money as compensation. So, what can we, the young generation, do? The first action we can take is to understand the indigenous people's needs. And the second action we can take is to show our care and support to them by reading the news and share those news on Facebook or other media. And the third action we can take is to join the organization to voice for them. Like Made of Taiwan is an organization that shares indigenous people's stories and opinions. So here, we want to stand here and say loudly to all of you that indigenous people are part of us. No one should be left behind. Our indigenous people deserve equal rights and equal treatment as we do. Thank you.